we're going to begin our discussion of the Civil War by first taking a look at Fort Sumter, which is an island in Charleston, in the Charleston Harbor. And this fort was actually one of the four southern forts that remained in Union hands in 1861. And if you'd forgotten, remember that the Union is to the north at this point, and the Confederacy is the south. So this was one of the four southern forts that remained in Union hands in 1861. We know that the leader of the Union at this time was Abraham Lincoln, and he had a lot of big choices to make during this war. And one of the first choices he had to make regarding this war was what he should do about Fort Sumter. Lincoln decided that he was neither going to abandon the fort, but he wasn't going to reinforce it either. And on April 12, 1861, the Confederate troops began to destroy the fort. So he knew that they were coming, and he couldn't make up his mind whether to abandon it or just to reinforce it. So he left it alone. He supplied the people there with food and things like that, but he'd never actually made a final decision. And this whole thing with Fort Sumter leads us to look more at secession, because we need to know which states are going to stay in the Union and which states are going to join the Confederacy, because that sets the stage for the Civil War. So if we take a look at this map, we can see the states that actually did secede from the Union. Okay, in 1861 we have Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee secede, and that kind of rounds out our Confederacy at 11. West Virginia in 1863 is joined into the Union, and really the western counties of Virginia were opposed to slavery, so the Union took them in at that time. There was also four remaining slave states, and those were Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri, and they too also remained in the Union. So we have the fall of Fort Sumter. We kind of have the layout of who's in the Union and who's in the Confederacy, and that leads to the second battle of the Civil War after Fort Sumter that we're going to look at, and this is the Battle of Bull Run. So let's fly over there and take a look at the Battle of Bull Run. This happened 3 months after the fall of Fort Sumter, and this was a one-day battle that started really with the Union Army taking quick control. So the Unions were in favor, they were doing well, but the Confederates were able to hold their ground and gain the first victory in the afternoon. And that was kind of set the stage for the whole day, because we also meet a man named Stonewall Jackson during this time. And Stonewall Jackson was a Confederate leader who was really tough and really hard-nosed, and he saw the Union Army coming at him. And he just stood there and he waited for them to come. And his actual name was Thomas J. Jackson, but during this battle he got the nickname Stonewall because he didn't even flinch when he saw that Union Army coming at Bull Run. And another general at this time shouted, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall." But he didn't move, and he stood his ground, and he was ready for anything. And so this was the first Confederate victory of the war, and really the first, besides Fort Sumter, was really the first major loss for the Union. And one thing that Lincoln knew he had to do was kind of reinforce the Union, because that was a big morale booster for the Confederacy, and he didn't want his army going down right away. So what he did is he placed George McClellan in charge of the Confederate Army near Washington, D.C. And he also stepped up enlistments because he didn't want an army to start shrinking, especially after a big loss. So we have George McClellan now in charge of the Union Army at Washington, D.C. Another head of the Union Army was Ulysses S. Grant. Grant really had a big impact right away because he was able to have victories at Fort Henry and at the Battle of Fort Donelson. Okay, so he comes into play in 1862 when he takes both of these, and then this was a big morale booster for the Union. Because they had just lost the Battle of Bull Run, they had lost Fort Sumter, and these were the first major battles under Grant at this time. If you look at the map, we can see, if we zoom out far enough, that Fort Henry is located in Kentucky and Fort Donelson is in Tennessee. Grant was also able to have a huge victory at Shiloh. And what's funny about this is Grant was not at all prepared for this battle. The Confederates initiated a surprise attack on Grant, but he was actually able to overcome it. And this was a very, very large battle in terms of deaths and injuries, as over 100,000 men were either killed, wounded, or captured during this battle. And adding to this list of Union victories that are starting to pop up, especially at New Orleans, and their general David G. Farragut. David G. Farragut was able to take a Union fleet of about 40 ships to New Orleans. And this place was so important because New Orleans was the biggest city and also the biggest port in the Confederacy. And so Farragut was able to take his 40 Union ships and he was able to seize New Orleans, which was a huge victory for the Union Army over the Confederacy. So we see all these Union victories starting to happen, and then we go all the way to Antietam. And when we get to Antietam, we're going to look very, very briefly at a Confederate general named Joseph E. Johnston. The reason we're looking at him is because he paved the way into another important leader at this time, Robert E. Lee. Lee was a Confederate general who took control after Johnson was injured in battle. Lee's first and main goal was to save the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, because McClellan, who we looked at before, his troops were in Richmond, Virginia, and he didn't want them in their capital. So Lee decided to drive them out, and he was successful at doing that. So he got the Union Army away from his capital, and then he led his attack into Washington towards the Union capital. Things didn't go very well for Lee, and it's kind of funny because he actually left his plans for attack wrapped around cigars, and a Union corporal ended up finding them. Not a very good thing for Lee. One of the big things that McClellan realized after finding these plans was that Lee wasn't with Stonewall Jackson at this time, another one of the Confederate generals. And so he decided to attack them, knowing that they weren't together and he could split them up. More than 26,000 people died in the Battle of Antietam. The day after this battle, Lincoln expected McClellan to finish off the Confederate Army. They were in a perfect spot. He had just defeated Lee after realizing he wasn't with Jackson, and Lincoln expected him to follow those troops into Virginia and finish them off. But McClellan didn't do that, probably because the troops were exhausted from the battle, but he didn't do what Lincoln expected him to, and he was actually replaced as commander of the Union Army. We've had kind of some questions in some classes at this time about what Great Britain was doing during this war. And if we fly over there, it's important to understand that Great Britain actually remained neutral during the Civil War. The Confederacy really hoped that Great Britain would view them as an independent nation and support them. And the main reason they thought that would happen is because they had a lot of cotton, and Great Britain usually needed cotton. And with the big plantations in the South, they thought they could supply them with their needs. But unfortunately for the Confederacy, Great Britain had accumulated a huge resource of cotton before the war took place, and they didn't need it. So they decided that their best bet was to remain neutral in this war. After the Confederacy kind of took one in the chin when those plans were left on the cigar boxes, they did gain two quick victories at the beginning of 1863 at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, Virginia. After the defeat at Chancellorsville, however, their luck kind of ran out because Stonewall Jackson was shot in the arm by one of his own guards. They didn't realize it was him. They shot him, got him in the arm, and they amputated his arm, hoping to save him. But shortly after the amputation, he came down with pneumonia and died on May 10th, 1863. This leads us into one of the most well-known Civil War battles. If you haven't guessed it yet, we're talking about Gettysburg. Gettysburg took place from July 1st through July 3rd, 1863. And we can look at kind of four main leaders during this, two on the Confederacy and two on the Union. In the Confederacy, we had A.P. Hill and General Robert E. Lee. And on the Union side, we had John Buford and General George Meade. This three-day battle started with day one on July 1st, and this was kind of both sides setting up their defenses and gaining reinforcements once they realized who was all involved. And we have 90,000 Union troops versus 75,000 Confederate troops. Day two was a big day for the Confederates, as they were able to drive the Union troops away, and they really took total control of Gettysburg. On day three, they realized what good position they were in, and so they decided that they were finally going to attack the Union lines. They didn't realize that over the course of day two and into day three, the Unions had kind of reinforced their barrage, and they fired on the rebels during day three when they came to attack their line. Lee realized what a bad position he and the rest of the Confederate South was in, so they decided to give up their attempt, and he took his troops back to Virginia. At the time of Gettysburg, there was also another very important battle going on at Vicksburg. Vicksburg was such an important area because it controlled all water traffic throughout the Mississippi River. Ulysses S. Grant was the Union commander at this battle, and he sent one of his men, Benjamin Grierson, to lead his brigade through the heart of the Mississippi. He wanted him to really do two things. One was to destroy Confederate rail lines, which he did, and the other was to distract the Confederates from Grant's unit, and he did that as well. Grant had the city of Vicksburg surrounded by April 30th, 1863, and he shot at the city for many hours of the day for 18 days, forcing the Confederates to take cover in caves that they had dug out of the hillsides. Vicksburg eventually fell to the Union Army on July 4th, 1863. After Vicksburg, the hits kind of kept coming for the Confederacy. William Tecumseh Sherman was told that he was going to be the new leader of the Union armies because Ulysses S. Grant was appointed commander of all the Union armies. So Sherman took over the division at Mississippi. And one thing he did is he began his march throughout the Southeast. And that was in the spring of 1864 when he began this. And this led him through Georgia. And he was heading towards the Atlantic Ocean. And the whole way through this march, he destroyed everything in his path, even burning down most of the city of Atlanta. As if things weren't unraveling quickly enough for the Confederacy, they were forced to vacate their capital in Richmond, Virginia. The good thing was for the Confederates, though, is that they were abandoned that the day before the Union soldiers got there, on April 3rd, 1865. The Confederates set Richmond on fire so that the Union couldn't take it, but this at the end led to an end of the Civil War. This event also led to the Confederate surrender on April 9th, 1865. The surrender took place at the Appomattox Courthouse. This was the location where Lee and Grant met to arrange the Confederate surrender. Lincoln made sure that these terms of surrender were generous, and afterwards Grant sent Lee's troops home, and he even gave them 3 days' worth of rations to actually make it home.